Good evening. Thank you, Timothy. Good morning and good evening, or around the world, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Frank Januzzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation. It's a great pleasure for me this evening in Washington to welcome an old friend, Evelyn Goh, who I first met too long ago when I was a young analyst at the State Department visiting Singapore. And Evelyn was a researcher, maybe doing your PhD work at the time. I'm not sure, Evelyn. I think you were working out of London, but something had brought you to Singapore for a conference on Southeast Asia, perhaps Cambodia, or on the fringes of the Shangri-La dialogue. But in any event, I thought at the time, oh, here's a bright rising star in the field of Asian studies. And of course, 25 years later, she has distinguished herself as a true a leading scholar on history, international relations, and how Asia fits together. I was telling Evelyn just before you all joined that it's rare in my experience that a book comes along that helps to change the way that I think about and view how the world fits together. It's a bit like the first time you study physics and suddenly you begin to see formula in the world around you relating to Newtonian physics and seeing how things work. And the book that Evelyn and her colleague Barry Buzan from ANU have put together is one of those books that reframes and reimagines and helps us rediscover the essence of the troubled, difficult, complex relationship between China and Japan. It's a particular field of interest of my own. I was excited to be, for 1 year, a visiting fellow in Tokyo at Nakazone's think tank, studying the Japan-China relationship. And I stumbled upon one of the many points that Evelyn and Barry have already noted, which is that these two countries are as much alike as they are different. And that there is, I think, what Barry called sort of the narcissism of small differences that complicate the relationship between China and Japan. But Evelyn's contribution to this wonderful book is to help us explore the Japan-China relationship in a deeper historical context, and also to therefore reimagine how the two nations might in the future interact with one another in such a way as to be in a more harmonious, friendly, and cooperative mode. And so Evelyn is going to speak to us a bit this evening. She'll give a presentation about her book, which I encourage you to read. There's, I will ask Tim maybe to post a link for how you can find it at Amazon into the chat box. And she's going to speak for 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll be delighted to take some questions from you, our Mansfield audience. So Evelyn, again, thank you so much for joining us from your home in Australia, where it's morning time, and we appreciate this opportunity to enrich our evenings in Washington with your thoughts on this complex Sino-Japanese relationship. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Frank. And thank you everyone for being here. Frank, it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk about the book with you and with this audience in particular. As Frank's already mentioned, we do go back a long way, and it's been always an enlightening and fun experience talking to Frank about East Asian security and US policy in Asia. And I've learned a great deal from him over the years, both in Asia and also in DC when I've been there. So it's a particular pleasure to be able to talk to you. I've got some slides which I think will help me to keep to time in keeping this talk to about half an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and use the slide share function so that we can all look at these and see if we can make them helpful. So as Frank's already mentioned, what I'm going to talk about this evening for you comes out of the book, which has just been published earlier this year. It came out in March in the US office, in January in the UK, and of course has been caught up in the COVID crisis. So Barry and I are gradually beginning to talk about the book in greater detail to various international audiences. As Frank's already mentioned as well, is available in all the usual book suppliers. I'll have a code for you at the end of the talk, which will give you a bit of a discount if you'd like to purchase a copy. It's available in paperback and ebook as well. Now the book is actually, unfortunately, 3 books really, rather than 1 book. Frank's read it, so I think he knows what I mean. Barry Buzan, my co-author, is a very eminent international relations scholar who's done a great deal of path-breaking work in strategic studies and international relations. A lot of it not actually related to Asia. So it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to collaborate with an international relations and security scholar to bring a new set of lenses into what is, after all, and a very old endemic seeming problem in East Asia. It's 3 books in one, because in part 1 of the book, Barry goes through this idea that China and Japan are very much alike each other if we think about them as slightly autistic great powers, trapped by this narcissism of small differences between them. And then the second part of his analysis, Barry thinks about a new framework in which we can analyze that shared history between them that takes us beyond the Sino-Japanese wars, that very difficult period in their shared recent history that seems to dog a lot of their contemporary problems. So it's quite an interesting part of the book that sets up some general yardsticks if we wanted really to think about what has China done for the region? What has Japan done for the region? To what extent is each of them responsible for the problems that the region has had? But to what extent has each of them been responsible for the huge advances and progress that the region has made as well over the last 150 years? So it's a bit of a new take on that idea of, what history do these 2 countries, these 2 great powers indeed of East Asia, actually share? Now, obviously that opens up the lens of history. So our effort in that part of the book is to say, well, let's take history seriously. But if we take it seriously, then we have to look beyond that narrow period of the Sino-Japanese wars that we tend to focus on today when we think about the Sino-Japanese relationship and the history of that. And the third book within the book is the section, as Frank indicated, that I did, where my interest really is thinking about, this conundrum of, is it really true that China and Japan have a deep-seated, long-standing problem of working with each other, right? Of being able to cooperate with each other or being able to coexist with each other. And that part of the book really thinks about this in the frame of great power bargains or strategic bargains between these 2 countries. I set up the framework, and then I look at the sort of long history between them since about 1400. We pick 1400 because that's about that time when we can think about China and Japan as polities, right, as states, roughly. And trace important periods in that joint 600-year history in which we might identify the grounds for cooperation and coexistence between them, and look at the conditions for that kind of coexistence. I use that framework also to think about the contemporary relationship between China and Japan and how far they are, very short of that ability to coexist and cooperate with each other. I then take all those lessons and think about, what does this mean, right? If we're interested, as we all are, in the future of East Asia, right? What do the troubles and the opportunities of that relationship give us in terms of new thinking and innovative ideas about where this relationship would have to go in order for regional order to have a more promising future. It's really that last part today that I want to spend a bit of time talking through in this short time I have for this presentation. Now, the reason I'd like to do that is because Barry and I felt very seriously in the course of doing this book that we really wanted to contribute to the field and to policy thinking a set of, non-American centric points of view for thinking about the future of East Asia's order. We wanted to present a slightly more objective, strategic assessment of what our options might be going forward, right? But I guess I'd offer a caveat at this point to say that, none of this work is prescriptive. We don't have a preference, right, for any of these scenarios that I'm about to outline for you. What we really want to do is to offer some historically and empirically grounded, out-of-the-box thinking, right, for alternatives that we feel that we might be facing in the region. At a juncture now today, which we both are convinced is a sort of critical juncture for the region, where, as scholars, we have a great deal of responsibility to try and put on the table, right, different and grounded ways of thinking that might help to push forward new ideas and creative policy options for the policymakers who drive regional dynamics today, including American foreign policymakers as well. So this really is an effort to inform and to stimulate new perspectives rather than to push one scenario or the other. So what I'm going to briefly do is to sketch for you sort of our conclusions from the book, in other words, of where we think we might be going in the region and where the current situation is and the boundaries of possibilities that current situation we've got in the region places on the future. Broadly, just in summary, this slide up here just summarizes for you the 4 scenarios that I'm going to sketch for you. It's a little bit unusual compared to some of the debates and discourses that US and American audiences probably used to. My reading of the US literature is that we often see the top 2 quadrants being discussed, right? We verge very quickly from one G1 scenario to another one, which is we either have US hegemony, which I think you prefer to call US leadership, or we have Chinese hegemony, right? And that's what we sort of focus on in the US debate. Barry and I present in the book 2 other alternatives, which I think are much less often discussed, which is what we call the 2 G2 scenarios, either US-China condominium or China-Japan condominium, right? And we sketch the outlines of these 4 alternatives. Now, as I said, we take quite a different sort of starting point for this analysis. And I'm just going to, in this presentation, kick us off on quite recent history. I won't go back 600 years, but I will go back to the starting point that Barry and I both feel is critical to understand if we want to explain today's context between China and Japan. You are broadly, I think, familiar with that difficult relationship we've got between these 2 great powers today, whether it's about ships colliding in the East China Sea or that very difficult diplomatic relationship between the 2 countries' leaders. Our argument is that we get there today not because of the short-term day-to-day operations of contemporary international relations between these 2 countries, but we've gotten here on a trajectory that really began with Japan's rise in the mid sort of 19th century, with the Meiji Restoration and Japan's entry, really, Japanese leaders' decision to enter what we now recognize as the Western Westphalian order. That really coincided with the collapse of this, historical Sinic order in East Asia, where imperial China was sort of, in a bit of a crumbling mess. And it really was that what we call unresolved power transition between Japan and China in East Asia, right, that we're living at the tail end of today still. And it's not possible to understand today's alienation between China and Japan without at least going back to the mid-19th century and understanding that attempt at a power transition by Japan to overtake and to take over China's central role in East Asia is really, the most recent turning point in that fraught history. Trouble, of course, is that is an unresolved power transition. The Sino-Japanese Wars got conflated with the Second World War, which involved colonial powers and the United States in this East Asian theater. The result of that conflation of those sets of wars was that there was no direct settlement between China and Japan at the end of that war. Now, power transitions that involve systemic war usually end with a peace settlement that is the great opportunity to set out the new world after the war, as we saw largely in the Western European context particularly. This did not happen in East Asia, right? There's no direct settlement. What we did get was the US interposing itself, right, between the two antagonists in East Asia, China and Japan. What we have today, still the situation of the United States acting as what we would call a ring holder between China and Japan, holding them apart from each other and holding the peace between them in the post-Second World War, post-Sino-Japanese Wars period. And it was within that context of the US acting as ring holder that China and Japan managed to negotiate some degree of normalization in relations from about 1972 onwards. But we argue in the book that that's a very circumscribed normalization of that relationship that still involved no direct settlement between China and Japan of their fraught power transition, which therefore remains unsettled today, right? Now, what was this US ring holder role is something that is crucial to understand. This relies on two things: the US providing a parallel set of bargains, right, for guarantees, if you want to put it that way, first to China and then to Japan vis-a-vis each other. So for China, the US alliance with Japan essentially, sorry, let me go back a bit because this slide is confusing in this context. The US reassurance to China was that the US alliance with Japan would continue to put a cap on Japanese militarization or remilitarization. Essentially, that the US security treaty with Japan would restrain Japan indefinitely by holding it constant as a partial power, right? One that is deeply circumscribed by its constitution and by the alliance relationship to being a non-offensive military power. For Japan, similarly, the US assurance was that that security treaty would guarantee Japan US backing, defense, and support in the event of Chinese aggression or militarized assertion against Japan, right? So that was a parallel guarantee that the US has held for each of these antagonists, holding them apart from each other. Now, the crucial part is this, that these parallel bargains or guarantees have been disintegrating in the post-Cold War period, right? China no longer sees the US alliance with Japan as restraining Japan. Quite the contrary. Chinese leaders have for about 20 years now been arguing, over 20 years actually, 30 years now, been arguing that the US treaty with Japan has been facilitating Japanese militarization, right? Has been facilitating that gradual reinterpretation of Japanese constitutional elements to facilitate Japan's gradual deployment of self-defense forces overseas for increasing scope and domains of military roles for Japan in the region and outside of the region in support of US military campaigns, for example. For Japan too, China's increasing assertion in areas like the East China Sea seems to present evidence that China is undeterred by the US and its allies in East Asia. So that crucial set of mutual, parallel bargains that the US has held between China and Japan have been disintegrating seriously in the post-Cold War period. Right? This is obviously exacerbated by growing concerns about the durability and reliability of US commitments in East Asia more broadly, right? Particularly over the last 5 years or so. So we're in that situation in East Asia today, right? That's our starting point for thinking about what we might conceive of as possible scenarios for the future. And in the book, we sketch 4, right? It's really the first 4. As I showed you in the quadrants before, I just wanted to show you this slide to highlight that there is, of course, a 5th scenario, which is the naked power competition one, which we don't take a lot of time to sketch in the book, because that is basically the de facto outcome if none of the other 4 eventuate, or that is the de facto outcome if efforts at one of the other 4 fail. Okay. Let me take you through very briefly in the short time I've got each of these scenarios in turn. Now, scenario 1 is really the situation of, is there a way to renew and therefore perpetuate what we're calling the US ring holding scenario? In other words, can we perpetuate the status quo in some ways? Now, recall that I've already said that the current status quo is unsustainable because that parallel set of bargains, has disintegrated, right? But this is also the scenario that most people, both in the United States and in the region, really, really want to continue. This is the one that everyone prefers, right? For various different reasons. Mostly in the region, mostly because it's the devil we know, right? But it's broken, as I said. So, trying to keep the US as the cork in the bottle, or that ring holder will still require some changes to happen, right? If we conceive of the US, China, Japan triangle, right, as something like a 3-legged stool, right? It's kind of in this weathered, broken down stage, right? The legs are about to fall off. So even if we wanted to somehow think about having more of the same, right, there's going to have to be a need to find more sustainable terms, right, for this ring holder scenario to be sort of renewed and sustained, right? As I said, this is the stuff of American aspirations and regional hopes. But what would it entail, right? At the very least, for the US, it's going to entail having to massively emphasize and renew that idea of the United States as being indispensable for East Asian security, right? That idea of renewing sort of regional faith in the US security umbrella is going to be crucial, right, for this scenario to persist. But that's going to have to come because of the disintegrating bargains between US, China, and Japan. It's going to have to come at the price or the cost of Japan's continued normalization in military terms, right? This is simply because that element of active balancing against arisen China is going to become so much stronger in this scenario, right? This, of course, creates a series of deeply unstable dynamics, right, in that central triangle. As I said before, the original bargain was one that, defined stability, right, as the US being the preponderant power, Japan being held down, and China being held back, right? That no longer is possible because, China isn't being held back, refuses to be held back. And Japan is already on that path of partial normalization. The greatest difficulty, I think, with this scenario is the question of why should China accede to this? Why should China buy this set of arguments? Why would China want to delay its national rejuvenation, temper its aspirations, which it views as justified? And why would it put aside or delay its national reintegration aims? This is the greatest difficulty with this scenario. It is precisely because of these difficulties with this scenario that Barry and I really felt that we had to sketch out some other ones that we hope would spur some new thinking about what might be possible in the region. The second scenario is the one we call G2.1, and this is the US-China condominium scenario. Now, this one is very compelling for those who believe, A, China has risen, and B, there are massive global commons problems that really require the world's two greatest powers to collaborate with each other. Climate change, for example, nuclear proliferation, so on and so forth. And those of you who have been around long enough, which I guess includes me and Frank, will remember the G2 debates and agendas that came out in the early to mid 2000s that were based very much on the idea of why we need China and the US to work together for financial stability and global economic management, essentially. So this is not a sort of wild scenario, as you know. Given our focus on the China-Japan relationship, Barry and I were keen in this scenario to highlight various things that may not be so obvious for those of us traditionally, fixated on the US-China relationship. We point out that even if we moved from a sort of current situation to a G2.1 situation, the Japan factor remains important in the East Asian context. We would essentially, this is a somewhat complicated diagram to make a very simple point, which is that moving to a G.1 scenario would essentially mean that Japan would risk being bypassed, right, in that great power relationship, which is what Japanese policymakers have always been most, concerned about. Japan would essentially be moving from a, situation in which it's in a stable marriage, right, with the United States, to one in which it is the outsider, right, in that triangular relationship, because the US and China would have moved into a stable marriage, leaving Japan as the uncomfortable third party in this relationship. However, we take some time in this part of the book to say that that doesn't leave the Japan factor irrelevant, right? Instead, we think about what might have to happen to the US-Japan alliance relationship in the context of a G2.1, right? There's a lot of literature out there that makes easy assumptions about what would happen to Japan if there were a US-China condominium, right? A lot of it basically implicitly suggests that Japan would somehow disappear. This is obviously not possible in a regional security context, and certainly, unfeasible given the current US commitments to Japan. And so we think about three sub-scenarios of continued alliance between the US and Japan, a downgraded alliance, and an abrogated alliance. Obviously, there's sort of difficulties and political minefields in each of these sub-scenarios. But we take a bit of time to point out the sort of, more fine-grained variations in each of these. For example, in the event of an abrogated alliance, instead of fixating on how terrible this would be for US credibility, which it will be, we think about the logical consequence of this, which is that, in the scenario of a G2.1 and an abrogated alliance, the US and China would have to think about a different way to extend joint security guarantees to Japan. This is the most realistic option, right, in that kind of scenario, where you replace the bilateral alliance with a joint guarantee, or a joint guarantee of neutrality for Japan, for example. in the East Asian context. So because of the shortness of time, I think that's about all I can do in highlighting that scenario. Happy to talk more about it if you have questions. Let me move to scenario 3, which in many ways is the most interesting and under-considered one of the 4 scenarios. This is 2.2, G2.2, which is essentially China-Japan condominium. Now, this is, of course, the most radical. It requires us to shift 2 fundamental assumptions when we think about East Asian order. First of all, we've got to accept that power sharing is possible in the region. Now, we already relaxed that assumption in thinking about US-China condominium, right? But we've also got to assume in this scenario that regional powers in East Asia can determine regional order by themselves, right? Now, this one is very difficult. It's not just difficult for a US audience, it's very difficult for an East Asian audience also to think about this, simply because we've all become accustomed, right, to that relatively short history of US preponderance in the region, right? But these are the 2 radical assumptions that we will make for this scenario. And, the outcomes of a G2.2 condominium between China and Japan would be extremely radical, right? Xi Jinping's idea of an Asia for Asians, right? Not his original idea. This is an idea that's been had since the 1950s in the region, would come true. Importantly, also, Japan would exercise its prerogative as the swing state in East Asia by swinging to the other side. Right? We also forget that Japan is a swing state. It can actually decide which great power prevails in East Asia by making a choice. So far, its choice in modern history has been in favor of the United States. But if it changes its mind, G2.2 becomes the determining pillar of East Asian order. This scenario, of course, also portends the end of US hegemony in Asia, right? Of course, many things have to come to pass, which I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer session for this scenario to come true, right? But it's one that I think is important to bear in mind as, an outer parameter for the range of possibilities in the region. And just because it's uncomfortable doesn't make it, something that we mustn't talk about or think about. In the book also, we go through some of the intellectual antecedents for this idea of China-Japan condominium, and we find there to be, audiences and arguments for this on both the Chinese and the Japanese sides, right? For functional as well as identity reasons. So it's not a figment of our imagination. It has been at various times thought about and argued about in both China and Japan. In scenario 4, the final scenario, this is the one of Chinese hegemony. Again, the one that, in many ways gets featured a lot in somewhat paranoid discussions sometimes these days. This is, of course, the highest risk scenario, not just for the United States, but for the region as well. But also the most potentially interesting one. Again, we tend to have this idea that Chinese hegemony will be, a certain way, right? We take a bit of time in the book to sketch why Chinese hegemony will be that quite interesting scenario by taking into account, imperatives that the Chinese leaders have to keep in mind, many of which are competitive imperatives, right? The impetus for thinking about this Chinese hegemony scenario, of course, are very, very strong, particularly today in the region, right? There's a very strong argument, right, that it's been game over for US hegemony in the region because of that gradual Chinese assertion in the region, which many perceive to have been insufficiently responded to by the United States. All right, I'm just trying to put it in as generic a way as I can. At the same time, there's been very clearly a decline in some of the conditions that have previously facilitated a more a clearer case for China not asserting its hegemony. So, for example, the decline in mutual interdependence between the US and Chinese economies, right? It's a very, very strong argument there for the sort of falling of facilitating conditions that might have mitigated against Chinese push for hegemony. What we do in this case when we sketch it is we try and sort of move beyond that slightly emotional debate, and we think, and we sort of, take the scenario and we say, okay, if it's Chinese hegemony, right, what type of bargain, right, would China have to forge as a regional hegemon, right? And what kinds of hegemonic imperatives would China have to take on in East Asia, right, in this scenario? Now, the reason we ask this question is the following, right? I know that hegemony is thought of in a certain way in the US discourse, remarkably similarly to the way the word is used in the Chinese discourse. Barry and I take the classical understanding of hegemony, right, which is a lot more benign than the popular usage of the word, right? My way of putting it is to say that we think of hegemony as deeply unequal power backed by a greater portion of consent than coercion, right? So you're only preponderant if all you're doing is coercing everybody else into accepting your power. You are hegemonic if there is consent, right, by those in the region for your leadership, okay? Which is what leads us to think about things like what kind of bargain would China have to forge with the different actors in East Asia, including Japan, importantly, to make its hegemony acceptable in the region, right? What kinds of responsibilities would China have to take on in East Asia to function as a hegemon? Now, the moment you ask the question that way, it makes the scenario radically different from the one that is implied in a lot of the current literature, which seems to suggest that China would be able to ride roughshod over the region and to impose its will in a purely coercive sort of way in the region. So in this scenario, we make some predictions about what a China hegemonic regional order would look like. And it's not an easy one, right? At the very least, we quite confidently predict that China would have to scale back and to make some trade-offs, right, in the many things it wants to achieve in the region, partly because it's got to establish authority, which comes out of consent in the region. We actually find the possibility of a China-Japan reconciliation under this scenario to be quite strong, for example, simply because China can't afford to have the swing state in the region antagonistically opposed to it. It just, at the very least, provides too much friction to its achievement of purpose in the region. Again, I'm happy to talk about this in more detail. I've also published a short piece on this idea of what would China have to take on in terms of responsibilities if it becomes a regional hegemon. It's available in Global Asia, and I can put out that link for you later on as well. So I'm going to just end off by leaving this slide on the screen for you, because it summarizes a question that we always get asked when we present on this scenario. So what would have to change, right, from the current situation for any of these scenarios to come to pass? And I think this may provide quite useful talking points for the discussion that we're going to have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. So much food for thought here. And I will exercise my chairman's prerogative to ask you one quick question, but we already have a couple of questions queued up for you as well. As you know, there's great skepticism in the United States about the G2 US-China condominium. It was rather swiftly rejected by the Obama administration when Xi Jinping seemed to put it on the table at Sunnylands. And I think you accurately capture that the preference in the US is for the US hegemony to be sustained, but there's a great lack perhaps of realism about what that would entail. Even our withdrawal from TPP suggests a failure to grasp fully the strategic requirements of sustaining a U.S. hegemonic order. And that's why I'm so intrigued by your Japan-China model, as difficult as it presents to be. I guess my question for you is, in that kind of a model, a China-Japan G2.2, do you imagine Japan as a nuclear weapons state, so as to exercise its full rights as a condominium power in East Asia? And would the United States, I don't know if you're familiar with the board game diplomacy, but it seems to me that that G2 model, given the disparities in size and power between China and Japan, which are likely to be exacerbated over time, would that G2 model still require essentially a US security guarantee to Japan to make it work, to provide Japan with sufficient power and influence to maintain its position atop a G2 condominium with China in Asia? And then we'll go to other questions. I'm sorry, those are rather big questions, but the nuclear status of Japan, and then what kind of a role for America in a G2.2?
Thanks, Frank. No, that's a great question. And we do actually delve into this with some detail in sketching this scenario. First thing to be said is, no, there is no role for the United States on top of the G2.2. It would kind of make the G2.2 meaningless if there were a US role on top of this. What we do when we think about the China-Japan condominium is we draw a distinction, again, two sub-scenarios there. There's one scenario of a condominium being a more equal one between China and Japan, which will entail then Japan being nuclear. And one which I feel is slightly more likely of a sort of, I forget what we call it in the book, but I think we call it a more disaggregated hierarchical G2.2, where Japan is a bit more of a junior partner. In that scenario, the nuclear element is less obvious. And it would actually entail much more of a clear Japanese acquiescence to Chinese leadership in the region, and Japan as a bit of a regional sheriff, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
Yes. So we do draw that distinction there. We make the assumption in this scenario that the US role in the region would be, certainly compared to what it is now, a lot less maximalist, indeed quite minimalist. And we expect that one of the conditions very clearly for Japan in this scenario to get into a G2.2 would be, either a very serious downgrading of the security relationship with the United States, or an abrogation of that alliance relationship altogether. Now, again, the condition for the G2.2 will strongly have to be a very marked US drawdown from the region, at least, if not withdrawal outright. There's got to be a very marked US drawdown in the region. So the G2.2 really we expect to happen if we hit a really critical sort of, breakpoint in the current US dominated order.
Thanks very much. Akira Hoshino asks about the apparent contradiction between Chinese hostile military actions, the violations of airspace, the incursions, the belligerent posturing in the East China Sea, South China Sea, compared with Beijing's outwardly diplomatic moves toward rapprochement with Japan, and asks if you can't unpack that contradiction a little bit. In the book, you describe how Japan's rising national security normalization and China's growing military and economic political power set up a spiraling escalatory sort of dynamic between the two. But how to explain the duality here of muscle flexing on one side and diplomatic overtures on the other?
Thank you for that question. It's a really good one. And at a very general level, I think I've been arguing for a while now that we should be expecting to see this sort of duality in East Asia for the foreseeable future. And it's partly, again, because of that unresolved, power transition between China and Japan, and that untenable, disintegrated sets of bargains that the US has held with each of them. So these are manifestations, right, of the lack of a sustainable set of bargains among the great powers in the region today. I see the recent rapprochement between, Xi Jinping and until recently the Abe Shinzo government, to be a short-term improvement for fairly tactical reasons on both sides. I think that obviously it is good to see rapprochement like this happening, but I think it would be wrong to expect that that sort of diplomatic overture goes very deep or by itself would be able to resolve the problem that I've described, which is that medium-term deep one of these two countries really having very little basis at the moment, right, to negotiate a sustainable modus vivendi between them. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to live with this sort of duality for quite a while longer.
Thank you. Daryl Rico Doss, a former Mansfield fellow, gets to the crux of how Japan's response to U.S. unreliability as an ally may be driving Japan toward greater self-reliance, especially during the last 4 years of the Trump era, when on the one hand, the U.S. has tried to, I think, in many ways enhance the U.S.-Japan alliance, but in other fundamental ways, whether it's steel tariffs or the tension with ROK on troop presence in Korea and threats by Trump to essentially pull U.S. forces home from Europe and Asia, may have accelerated thinking in Japan that, well, gee, can we really rely on the United States to sustain its hegemony here? Or should we be making a plan B? And so I guess, can you tease out for us a little bit more whether you think the Japanese government itself is prepared to imagine either living under Chinese hegemony, sort of providing their consent, if you will, as you pointed out, or whether the Japanese government is aspiring in the future to a G2, China-Japan. Is that a model that anyone in Japan you think is prepared to embrace? I know that your particular field of expertise is not Japanese politics per se, but if you could offer some insights into the acceptability of those models for Tokyo.
Yeah, I've in the course of doing this project have been obliged to become an amateur Japan watcher. So with apologies for all the real Japan specialists out there, and please correct me if you think I'm getting anything vastly wrong here. I think the starting point is correct, that there's been, at the very least, very seriously growing Japanese discomfort with this idea that US reliability may be in question even more than usual, right? Anyone who watches Japan will know that US reliability is a question mark at all times, right? This is part of alliance dynamics. So, but that degree of discomfort has been on a sort of, rising trajectory, I'd say, since the Obama administration. And this is not something that began with the Trump administration. It would be easier to deal with if it only began with the Trump administration. There was a great deal of disappointment with the pivot to Asia, a great deal of disappointment with the failure to achieve TPP by the end of the Obama administration. And so, that discomfort already was there. I'd say, again, this is where the historical analysis in the book is fairly useful, I think. I would say that the idea that there is a deep-seated sense of antagonism and opposition to China and Chinese leadership in the region within Japan, I think that idea is a little bit misplaced. If you look at even sort of post-Second World War Sino-Japanese relations, at very clear, marked, critical junctures in that history, the Japanese have shown themselves, right, to be quite willing to think both pragmatically and creatively, right, about that relationship with China. In the immediate post-war period, right, there was close Chinese-Japanese economic cooperation, and that was reciprocated by even, the communist Chinese in the PRC who wanted, right, Japanese economic aid and expertise in that period. If we look at the 1970s and the drive towards China-Japan normalization, there was a huge drive for that already within Japan, especially within the business community, right, which was only held back because the US hadn't normalized with China, and therefore Japan was constrained. But as soon as Nixon achieved rapprochement with China, the Japanese were first off the mark, right, towards opening of official diplomatic relations. And again, of course, in more recent history, Prime Minister Hatoyama was the last one, in the late 1990s to think about a much, much closer relationship with China. Indeed, to some alarm in the Clinton administration, right? Those of you who were involved in this would remember this. So I wouldn't say that these more positive sentiments towards China were not significant within Japan.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm sorry. In the interest of time, I think I'll get to a few more questions. Your answer is expanded upon in the book because you do take that 600-year deeper dive into the relationship between China and Japan, and you point out the many periods of the history of the two nations when there was comity and trade and a ability of the two to coexist peacefully in Asia. And it is, I think, partly an artifice of history and our own inability to imagine history beyond our own personal experience that makes us perhaps too quick to dismiss the possibility of Japan, China working things out. And I think your book even talks about the Chinese reformers at the end of the Qing dynasty, sort of admiring the accomplishments of Japan in its modernization drive and so on. So now Andrew Oros touches on this a bit. He asks, wouldn't the conservative nationalistic forces in both China and Japan stick to their guns and deny that China and Japan are two sort of very similar countries, sort of deny that this is the narcissism of small differences. And I think, especially for the Communist Party in China, isn't it almost an imperative that their self-image and identity be clearly distinguished as different from Japan or the West? Must Japan and China embrace their similarities for your G2 model to work, or can the nationalistic forces be accommodated?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for coming. I think that's a great question, and again, that study of history really highlighted one thing for me, and also for Barry. I think I'm right in speaking for Barry on this one. That there's so little that is actually immutable in how these two peoples have looked at each other. There's so much of it that has been instrumental or in response to really critical junctures in not just their bilateral history, but in critical junctures in their responses to the changing international context, right? Barry does this particularly in his part of the book where he talks about their encounters with Western imperialism, right? And how much that massively shaped so many of their similarities as well, right? So we're not thinking about their similarities only insofar as the cultural roots, of their mutual civilizations being similar. We're not just thinking about that, but we're actually thinking about that, again, that 18th to 19th century experience where a lot of these more modern similarities were built out of that fraught encounter with the West. So I think, yes, the conservative nationalists on both sides have proven to be, serious breaks on innovative thinking about that relationship, certainly. But I feel that sitting today in 2020 on the cusp of what clearly is going to be a series of very challenging and potentially game-changing years in East Asian security coming up, or East Asian order coming up, that we may actually face in the near future one of these breakpoints, right, in international relations, where the conservative nationalists on both sides will begin to find arguments that have already been made, right, within the last 20 or 30 years, within each of their polities, to be quite compelling, if only for instrumental reasons. Don't forget that people like, arch realists in the Chinese context, scholars like Shi and Hong have made the argument for years that, China really needs to reconcile with Japan for the purely realist reason that you need Japan on your side if you're going to exercise regional hegemony, right? That's he's hardly, a liberal by any means.
Indeed. Speaking of game changers, two questioners, Alfred Nakatsuma and an anonymous attendee, invite us to reshape a little bit the game. Alfred asks, is there no place for ASEAN? You're quite familiar, Evelyn, with the concept of ASEAN centrality in Asia, not because ASEAN represents a very strong pillar, but maybe even precisely because it's a somewhat weak one. But the concept of ASEAN centrality, does it offer us a way to avoid the three-legged stool problem? Is there no fourth leg to the stool that could be added? Is there a way to reimagine the game altogether? I know that's beyond the scope of your book, which limits somewhat the scenario building. And along the same lines, an anonymous attendee asks about the Quad and whether the Quad, do you consider the Quad just another mechanism to sustain U.S. hegemony? Is this essentially just the U.S. bringing more power to bear in order to sustain its own leadership role? That's, with all fairness, that's the way I view it. But I'm curious whether you see that way, or does the Quad represent a way to change the game, and introduce a different model for stability in the region?
Thank you. Those are two great questions. And on the ASEAN centrality question and the ASEAN role question first, I suppose I'm a fairly good person to ask about this, since I do work on Southeast Asia. My short answer to that is my analysis of the ASEAN pillar of regional order is that it had a particular window of opportunity in the post-Cold War period. The ASEAN pillar actually grew up under the condition of US hegemony, functioning, strong US hegemony in the region. That provided that window of opportunity for this collection of small states to have a particular influence in the creation of regional norms and the creation of a certain way of regional negotiations and so on and so forth. My short answer is that if the ASEAN pillar were going to work in mediating regional order or mediating great power relations, it would have worked already because the conditions were propitious. If it hasn't worked already, the chances of it working have massively declined in the current context. So that's my short and unfortunately quite pessimistic answer. I wish I could be optimistic about that too, but I don't see any analytical grounds to be. On the Accord, obviously, first thing to be said is that the Accord is very new in its current format, a very new set of initiatives, very often at cross purposes with each other, depending upon which national perspective you are looking at. This includes the Australian one, which is the side of the debate I'm most familiar with, being located in Australia. I'd say that the Accord is analytically interesting because it is clearly the effort of key US allies in the region, including India, to think about how they might perpetuate the existing regional order without the hegemon, right? So for that reason, it's really interesting for those of us who are interested in these things. Pragmatically, I'm not sure that we've got a lot to go on at the moment. There's not enough meat in the empirical bones here because not enough time has passed to be able to assess the outcomes of this. But it clearly is a bit of a sort of, trial and error process of these partners potentially working through which bits of the regional order they think they might want to keep and how they could potentially police and maintain these bits of the order by themselves or not. I think that's about as much as we can say. I think that that's something that we've got to keep watching. There's obviously a great deal of difficulty with the Quad partners actually working with each other, right? There's also the psychological and pragmatic difficulty of, with the exception of India, the other Quad partners actually not having much experience in working autonomously outside of the US context, particularly in security matters. So I think there's a range, as many of you probably will know already, there's a range of national as well as functional difficulties with this cooperative endeavor.
Evelyn, we've reached the end of our allotted time, but I would like to request if you have another 10 minutes that you might devote to us.
I'm fine. I'm aware that you're all putting off dinner probably, so if you're willing to continue.
Well, your presentation has sparked a wonderful and lively set of questions. So if you will give us 10 minutes, then I will tell our audience that we will extend for 10 minutes in order to handle just a couple more questions and then give you the final word, Evelyn, for any closing thoughts.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. A question from my friend Paul Dickman. Where does Korea fit in any of this? And a question from Paul Linehan. To what extent will personalities and other intangible factors determine the viability of your power sharing models? Sometimes we make too much of personalities in the discussion of national interests, but I think sometimes maybe too little. The Nakasone-Reagan relationship was important. And we've seen some prime ministers be more skillful in their management of the China relationship than others. And so to what extent might personalities play a role in all of this?
Thank you. Thanks for those questions. Just a very brief alert that I've just put up the last slide there with the promotion code at the bottom in case you're interested in buying.
Yes, thank you. So yes, for those of you who want to get the book more inexpensively, Evelyn is sharing her book with us on the slide.
Let me take Paul Dickman's question first, because obviously, yes, we do get asked this a lot as well when we do our presentations on this book. And the short answer is that Korea features a great deal in this analysis. Obviously, it's impossible to think about, the history of China and Japan and that relationship without thinking about Korea. If there were a case for, including in a very serious way any other state in East East Asia, in this analysis, it would be Korea. So we do pay it significant amounts of attention, both in the historical analysis as well as in drawing these scenarios. Of course, on the scenarios question, the persistence or otherwise of the Korean Peninsula issues, let's put it that way, does skew many of these questions that we ask in each of the scenarios in fairly significant ways. So if we think about the Chinese hegemony scenario, for example, one of the key things China will have to take on if it wants to be regional hegemon, is the management of the unresolved multiple problems on the Korean Peninsula. We make the argument that these things, nuclear proliferation, division of the peninsula wouldn't simply disappear, right? If we simply remove the US from the landscape, that still doesn't disappear. And in the historical part of the analysis, of course, we pay due attention to, Korea's role in the sort of imperialist struggles between China and Japan, but also Korea's sort of facilitative role in that long history of amicable trading relations between China and Japan, for example. And notably, of course, Korea is the most sort of coherent state entity in this long history in that region, right? So again, the book is not about Korea. So we're obviously not able to pay it as much attention as Korean specialists would like. But it is the one other state that gets the most consistent amount of attention in the book, apart from China and Japan. To Paul Linehan's question, yes, I think we get asked about personalities. We also get asked about domestic politics as factors that might, make some of these scenarios more likely or less likely going down the line. I guess, I'm half a diplomatic historian by training. And so, as a result, it's kind of in my DNA to say that personalities can be determinative at critical junctures. They're not always determinative, but they can be, and they very often are. And if we look at the China-Japan relationship, it becomes obvious that, both personalities and domestic politics have had driving roles in the ups and downs of that relationship, both in history and in the contemporary context. So it was with some trepidation, for example, that we viewed the latest leadership transition in Japan, not because I have any doubts about Suga-san as a person, but that it seems to augur potentially a period where we might return to that instability in Japanese politics, where it's not obvious that there's going to be a prime minister who will be in office long enough with enough of domestic political control to be able to effect any adventurous or brave policies that would be required of Japan under some of these scenarios, for example. It was slightly easier to think about it under, again, Abe Shinzo's long premiership. On the Chinese side, it looks like we're stuck with Xi Jinping for a while. Again, that does create its own sort of conceptual problems and analytical problems, because the purposes and the imperatives of a paramount Chinese leader obviously change in some significant ways the moment they do become paramount and lifelong. So I think what we can assume about what motivates Xi Jinping, post 2019 is a little bit different than what we had assumed was motivating him pre 2019. So that's created some change as well there. But yes, the short answer is yes, I think personalities could, for better or for worse, in a passive or an active sense, prove to be quite important.
I suppose I should have been able to answer that question myself just by looking at the US leadership over the last 4 years and acknowledging that personalities do matter. Finally, let me pose one last question to you. There are others, but I can't have time for all of them. It goes to the question of China's ambitions. I think it is broadly assumed in the United States, and it's implicit in the arguments of people like Graham Allison on the Thucydides trap, that China aspires to hegemony, that China is in fact driving for hegemony, and that China perceives the United States as an obstacle to its establishing hegemony in East Asia. Do you agree? Does China have hegemonic ambition? If so, is it prepared to assume the responsibilities that your hegemonic model imply? That it's not just a question of enjoying the top spot, but it's also taking on the responsibilities that come with the title.
Yeah, I think yes. I think the short answer to both your questions is yes. Yes, I think it is fairly clear that this Chinese leadership aspires to national rejuvenation, and national rejuvenation entails hegemony, I think, in the more classical sense rather than in the coercive sense. And yes, they clearly see the US as and rightly, I think, see the US as an obstacle to that aspiration. I don't think anyone would dispute that. And the US intends itself to be an obstacle to that aspiration. So the message is received, I think. There's no ambiguity there. Now, your third question about whether Chinese leaders particularly perceive sufficiently the responsibilities that come with hegemony, I think it's still an open question. Certainly, they do perceive it. And I think that, Chinese efforts in various realms indicate quite a clear perception that there is that responsibility element in a variety of quite different realms. So if you think about, their climate change initiatives, right, including the recent announcement of going carbon zero by 2030, but that's not the only one, right? That's only the most recent announcement on the tail end of 2 or 3 quite significant target-related, international norms target-related climate change announcements. That, to me, is quite a significant sort of tick in the box of global responsibilities, right? If you look at the realms of things like, that have been studied a lot already, peacekeeping, for example, right? Contributions to certain United Nations key functions. They've clearly recognized these things for instrumental reasons or not for a long time. If you look at China's currently, very much overstudied outreach in terms of investment, infrastructure building, development support for its, countries, particularly in its peripheries. Again, we can be quite cynical about that, but the presentation in the form in terms of, these things are for mutual benefit because development is desired by these partners, right? And has the following flow-on effects for us as well as for you. Push towards ideas of, joint responsibility, right? But also great power responsibility to some degree or the other, for me. So I think there is an understanding of it, right? But whether, it would be willing to make that its primary platform as regional hegemon is still very much of an open question, particularly when we start thinking about the hard security things that a regional hegemon would have to do, right? As I said, that's something I look at in quite a lot of detail in that short piece in Global Asia, which I think we can put up the links on the chat side if you're interested. So I think the jury's still out on your third question, Frank, which is what, yeah.
The book is Rethinking Sino-Japanese Alienation, History Problems and Historical Opportunities, Barry Buzan and Evelyn Goh. Professor Goh, Evelyn, thank you so much for a very stimulating presentation today, for an excellent book. I encourage people who have not had a chance to read it yet to purchase it and read it. Any final thoughts for us this evening? Any pearls of wisdom you can offer to the U.S. government on how best to manage this complex world?
I don't have any pearls of wisdom except to say, good luck, guys, for the week. I think that you should know that the world wishes the best for you, if only because it's in our interest. And I hope that this book, what I've said this evening for you, and if you have a chance to look at the book, will help to expand our range of thinking about what may be possible for the United States and for the region. And if it does that for you, then I think Barry and I have very fully fulfilled what we set out to do. Thank you so much for your time and attention this evening.
Thank you so much. Please join me virtually in thanking Evelyn Goh. Thank you. Thank you, Evelyn. It's wonderful for you to join us. Enjoy your day in Australia on the South Shore. And thank you again from all of us at the Mansfield Foundation.
And you have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you. We are adjourned.